Okay, good evening everyone. My name is Johan Pires. I will be your moderator for this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of legal education webinars hosted by the USAID Co-Justice Project and the Colombo Law Society with the support of the Colombo Law Society President Mr. Vijay Gamage and committee members Mr. Vindra Gunsekara and Mr. Niroshan Sirivardhana. Co-Justice supports strengthening of skills and knowledge of members of the legal profession, working with counterparts such as the Colombo Law Society. Remote learning opportunities such as these webinars mean a wider, more diverse audience, which we hope will lead to a good question and answer session at the end. The Colombo Law Society was established in 1975 and is the largest branch association of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, with close to 4,000 life members representing the civil, criminal, unofficial bars and the judiciary. The Colombo Law Society makes a vital contribution to the legal fraternity in furthering its skills, knowledge, welfare, and independence. The commitment reflected in Colombo Law Society hosts this webinar series with Co-Justice. Just to keep you posted on how the webinar will operate, the lecture session will be approximately around 1 hour, and participant microphones will be muted during the session. Participant microphones will be activated during the second round of questions. And if any of you have any questions at any time during the session, you could type via the chat option, and Mr. Modi will be able to answer any of the questions. So in order to give you everyone a basic idea of this session, this webinar will test your critical thinking skills as a lawyer and explore why critical thinking matters for attorneys. The presentation will focus on a real case from the United States. Participants will see and hear the actual evidence and work with the presenter to analyze how to build an effective trial presentation. So just to give you a background on today's presenter, Mr. Kent Mortimer is a senior American lawyer with experience as a trial attorney in the US and the International Court in Kosovo. He has presented hundreds of cases to juries and judges. Mr. Mortimer is the chief of party of Co-Justice and has worked training judges, prosecutors, attorneys, and police in the US, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Kosovo, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So now I would like to hand over to Mr. Mortimer. Ken, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Johan, and I want to extend a special thanks to the Colombo Law Society for co-hosting these events. I have to tell you, it is my great honor to be here with you tonight, and I'm looking forward to leading an interesting discussion. And I'll describe for you a little bit more how I think that's going to go as we get into the presentation. I started putting together this webinar with certain goals and objectives, and I've laid them out for you here. My main goal is to explore with you critical thinking and to put some of your critical thinking skills to a test using a real case. My guess is that you are all pretty good at critical thinking, and some of you, I'm sure, know that, and maybe some of you don't know it. And we're going to find out as we go through this case. But you can read my goals and objectives on the slide there. Let me tell you just a little bit about what I have in mind, and I hope that when we get to the end, you will agree with me that this is a different kind of webinar than what you've watched in the past. And what I mean is that usually when I do this kind of lecture, I do it in person to an audience, and we can talk back and forth and interact. And that's a little more difficult in an online forum. But I think that we can probably do some of that. So what I'm going to ask you to do is stay by your computer if you can and participate. And if you would do something for me right now, we'll get started and I'll show what you need. Some of you already know how to do this because I've seen your texts, but if you go up, look on the left-hand side of your computer screen, and if you go up to almost the top where it says messages, click on public chat. And if you do that, that should open up a window that lists all of the comments that people have had. And let's test it and see. So I'm going to type good evening to all of you, and if you would type something or just a really quick hi or whatever message you want to share with everybody else. And what that will do is test to see if everything's working, and it'll give you some practice. And I see that you're making it work just great. Thank you. What I'm going to try to do as we go through this webinar is watch those comments. And so this is a good test of my multitasking skills. And I'll try to respond as we go through the webinar if you have comments or questions. And I will ask you at a couple points to share your thoughts with everyone. So if you wouldn't mind keeping that public chat open and use it, feel free to go ahead and type. I think you've probably already figured out that they turned off your microphones. It is just too difficult to have 85, 86 people with microphones open. So we're going to try to do it with the chat box and see how that works. And I'll be interested too at the end of this to see your feedback as to whether you think that this was an okay substitute for being in person. So let me get started, and I'm going to keep you on the keyboard here for a second. And I'll ask you to tell me what you think when you hear the term critical thinking. What does that mean to you? And I can tell you there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, but I'd like to gauge what you're thinking of when you hear that term critical thinking. Yeah, brainstorm is such a great part of it, and I will give you some examples of brainstorming as we look at how the investigation of this case proceeded. Sure, analytical skills, bias, interesting comment, thinking rationally. What does that mean, thinking rationally? I'm not often accused of thinking rationally. I think sometimes I'm accused of thinking irrationally. You know, as lawyers, one of the things that I think we always try to do is define our terms beyond the theory. I like that. I'm interested in the fact that just about everybody has said something a little bit different, and yet it's all related. Understanding something through analyzing, that's really good. Looking at things with an analytical mind to understand the reality. Common sense. Oh, what a great answer. Common sense. There's a famous American named Mark Twain, and one of his famous quotes is, the problem with common sense is that it's not so common. I like that answer though. Unpacking ideas. Okay, good. I'm gonna say thank you to all of you. First of all, for participating. This is fantastic. We're going to have a good discussion, thinking outside of the box. Yeah, I've got to mention that one because that's such a great idea. Thank you for participating. Thank you for offering your ideas. Thank you for reading what everybody else has offered. And let me share with you what some other people have had to say about critical thinking. Some famous people. Let me start with Socrates. And he was a Greek philosopher, old guy with probably more gray hair than I have. And he described critical thinking by saying this. He said that one cannot depend upon those in authority to have sound knowledge and insight. One must ask deep questions that probe profoundly. How does that sound in conjunction with the things that you wrote? Is that similar, do you think, or dissimilar? I'll leave that for you to decide. Let me offer for you another definition. I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary, at least the one that I went to, says an appraisal based on careful analytical evaluation. So there's that word analytical that several of you used when you provided your description of critical thinking. So let me turn to the law and see if I can use an American case to provide a definition of critical thinking. This is a case from 1964. It's not a new case, but it's a particularly famous case. And it was written by a fairly prominent American justice. And this is a case that has gotten a lot of publicity, and a lot of people have studied it over time. And if you will permit me, I'm going to make an analogy between critical thinking and pornography. Surprised? Let me show you what I mean. Justice Potter Stewart was tasked with writing the majority opinion in this case. And part of what he had to do was determine what is pornography. And his quote, and you can read it along with me, he said, "I shall not today attempt to further define pornography, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it." So he ducked the question, and I think I'm going to duck the question too, except to say that I hope that we can all agree that we know it when we see it, when we look at critical thinking. So the next question becomes, critical thinking, how do you do it? And this is a list of some of my ideas. And you will have a lot of materials, and I don't know if you've looked at them. I shared with you, I think, about 100 pages worth of materials, and I think just about every one of those articles attempts to provide a definition of critical thinking. They're all fairly similar, some differences, but these are some of the steps that I like to recommend, particularly in the context of being a lawyer and looking at how to analyze the case that comes through the door and working with your client and figuring out how to succeed in court and analyze the issues and frame the issues. Prioritization is really important. It may be one of the most important things to do. What's the most important thing? When I put together this webinar, the most important thing for me was putting together goals and objectives for you. And that really set the stage for all of the rest of the things that I wanted to talk about. And I think it's the same is true in your cases. What's the most important? And then as lawyers, we gather relevant information, interpret it. We may want to use experts in areas that we don't have expertise, and you'll see that in the case that we talk about. You want to find the logical relationships between ideas, and I'll give you some ideas about that too, and then draw conclusions. And as lawyers, these are the things that I think most of us do every day without really even knowing that that's what we're doing. And then we test our conclusions, and we're creative. And sometimes critical thinking is also creative thinking. And I had a student one time ask me to tell the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking, and I'm not sure I know how to do that. I think they go hand in hand. And what one of you said was thinking outside of the box. I think that's a big part of it too. So enough introduction here. What I propose that we do for the rest of our time on this webinar is to test our critical thinking with a real case. And let me tell you a little bit about this case before I dig into the evidence and start showing you some pictures and some of the other things that we knew about this case. This is a real case. It happened in the US state of Oregon, and this was an investigation that was particularly difficult. It spanned a number of weeks, and let me warn you, there will be some very graphic images. There's a lot of blood. I'll show you a dead body, and I will try to warn you before we get to that point. So if you want to look away or fold down the screen, you can do that. My intent isn't to shock you or provide you with unpleasant pictures, but as lawyers, particularly if we're dealing with criminal cases, but sometimes in civil cases as well. There are times when we have to look at unpleasant images, and so I'm going to give you all of the evidence and all of the best pictures that we have from this case. What I will ask each of you to do is put yourself in the position of being the lead detective or the lead prosecutor. Doesn't make any difference. And I realize that those are probably roles that most of you will never use in your legal career, but I don't think it makes any difference. I think criminal cases are easiest to analyze because they're generally people understand the difference between right and wrong more than they might understand the difference between technicalities in contract cases or patent cases. So I've chosen this case because I think the issues are pretty easy to understand, even understanding that most of you will probably never be detectives and will never be prosecutors. But I'd ask you, if you would please, imagine yourself, if you would, in one of those roles, and think like one of those people would think in trying to use your critical thinking skills and decide how you want to proceed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some pictures. I'll share with you an audio recording. All of these are the real evidence that we had. And I'll take you through the case and ask you to get back on the keyboard at times to share your thoughts, share your ideas, and see what you think, and use your critical thinking skills. So let me get started with just a few pictures here. And you are looking at a wedding picture. This couple was a little bit older at the time of the wedding, and so they're not wearing what I would consider to be traditional American wedding clothes. My understanding is that it was a fairly small wedding, limited to a few friends and mostly family. It was a Christian wedding, and you're looking on your left at Michael Taylor and his wife, Ruth Taylor. He was an administrative assistant in the country. She was a secretary, and this is a picture where he is demonstrating something that he picked out of his garden. I'm guessing this was probably toward the end of summertime, which would have been, let's say, August in Oregon. And you can look outside and you can see the sun is shining. And we would in the US call this a zucchini. I think you may call it a squash or a marrow. Anyway, this is a picture in their kitchen. If you look behind him, you can not only look out the window into the yard, but you can also see the sink and some dishes there drying. And what I'm going to do next, and before I go to the next slide, what I want to describe for you is what I expect you're going to hear. And we will provide you with a transcript so that you can read along as you hear. This is the 911 tape recorded as it was called in. And before we play it, let me ask you to listen really carefully, because there are a lot of things that the investigators found to be very interesting in this tape. One of the things that you'll notice is that if you listen carefully, you will hear the clacking of a keyboard. And what that is that when the operator takes the call, one of the things that she's instructed to do is to keep the caller on the line as long as possible. And concurrent with the conversation she's having with the caller, she's typing instructions to the police. So she's telling them what she knows, and she's telling them where to go. And she's also going to be dispatching an ambulance. So you don't know that all of that's going on during this tape, but if you listen and you hear the clacking of the keyboard, that's what she's doing. She's also tasked, as part of her training, with getting as much information about what happened as possible. The theory is that if she can capture the information quickly, it may protect the police and it may help solve the crime faster. This particular operator is really, really good. She is one of the best 911 operators I've ever heard. And this, in my 20 years as a prosecutor in the United States, this is absolutely the best 911 tape I've ever heard. I'll tell you that the dispatcher won several awards for the way she did it. The other thing that I'd ask you to pay particular attention to is the demeanor of the caller. And I think you will hear a couple of things that become interesting and maybe significant as we get into our analysis of this case. There are a couple pauses. There are a couple of pauses that are so long, you may think there's something wrong with our webinar. There's not. But those pauses will be there. And also, if you listen really closely, you'll hear the caller whispering. And I'd also ask you to pay attention to his demeanor. I will tell you that in the first day of the investigation of this case, the investigators and I probably listened to this recording 100 times. And we had all kinds of theories about what the pauses meant and what the whispering meant. Okay, so I have talked way too much. I'm going to stop talking now, and let's see if we can play for you the actual 911 tape from this murder case. I hope that you were able to hear that video. He walked outside the front door. The police and the ambulance had already arrived. He had his hands up, and the police secured him. And that's what you know at this point in the case, at this stage. Let me ask you a question right now, and this is for you to share with me and with the rest of our participants. Who killed Ruth? What do you think? I like that. You're asking me a question. Is it him? What do you think? We have two for Michael. What did anybody think it was somebody other than Michael? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah. Okay. Suicide. Okay. Interesting question. Not Michael. Can't say for sure. Okay. Can you prove it? Do you have enough evidence to prove who did it? Somebody other than Michael? Okay. Yeah, still not enough information was our conclusion. But I think everybody tends to look at the husband first. And that's borne out by statistics. And it sounds like many of you had the same thoughts, but not all of you. Confused when she asked about the gun. Yeah, wasn't that interesting? Did all of you notice that his inflection became very flat? He was kind of emotional and engaged, and when she asked, did he have a gun? He said, no. Very, very different. Yeah, was there a third person in there? And how could you figure out if that was the case? Not enough evidence, I agree with you, and that's where we were. So let me ask you another question as you continue to answer. Thank you so much for your answers. This is the kind of brainstorming that the police went through when they first arrived on the scene, and why they kept listening over and over again. And they thought maybe they did hear somebody else. What do you make of the long pauses in the recording, the times when he's talking with the dispatcher and then there's nothing? What do you think is the significance of those long pauses? Any ideas? Setting a scene. Okay, what is that? What do you mean by that, setting a scene? That's an interesting comment. Setting a scene how? What could he be doing? Trying to hide the gun. Okay, I'm going to come back to that one. That's an interesting thought, and that's also trying to cover up. Those were some of the same conclusions that the officers reached, hiding things. What would he be hiding? Probably the gun, right? So did he have enough time to do that? What else would he try to hide, or what other things might he be doing to try to set the scene? Yeah, and a number of you think that there might be someone else there. Yeah, interesting that he did make the call, so that's a sign that maybe he's trying to prove his innocence. Nervousness, did you get that from the tone of his voice? Flushing, hyperventilating. Emotionally confused. You guys are very, very good at analyzing this tape. Isn't that an interesting tape? There was no one else in the house when the police arrived. I will tell you that. What the police did was they secured Michael, put him in a police car in handcuffs, and they immediately went in to determine two things. First, they needed to determine if anyone inside the house needed medical attention. And the officer went in and determined that Ruth was dead. And they also cleared the house to make sure there was no one else there who posed a danger to the police. And they did a brief search of the outside area. Yeah, his tone did change. Wasn't that interesting? Maybe he was still checking on Ruth. That's one of the things that the dispatcher asked him to do, was go in and check. Did you notice that he knew where she was shot? In the neck. He already knew that before she asked him to go in and check. Does that have any significance? All right. Let me move on. You guys are really perceptive, and I predict that if you listen to that tape another 4 or 5 times, which is what you would probably do in the investigation, you'd hear other things. But I'm really impressed because you identified all of the major leads in the first hour or so on the scene. And the idea of a third person was something that was also a very interesting thought for the police. So let me ask you another question, and thanks so much for all of your answers. You're in charge. You're the boss. What do you do? What do you tell the detectives to do? What do you direct the other officers there to do? What experts do you need? What steps do you want to take so that you can solve this crime and have enough evidence to prosecute? Find the gun. Yep, that's when you talk about priorities, that's probably number 1. Forensic team. Secure the place. Okay, securing the place was done very quickly, and that's always important because you want to make sure that your officers are safe. Collect evidence. What kind of evidence do you want to collect from the scene? What do you want to know? What will fingerprints tell you? Identify the murder weapon. Talk about how you want to do that. These are great ideas. Okay, circumstantial evidence. What kind of circumstantial evidence might you see? Check and see whether the husband owns a gun. That's a little more difficult in the United States because there's no central registry for guns. But it is possible to run some checks and make that determination. Police record, great idea. Forensic expertise, yeah. And specifically, what kind of forensic expertise do you want to look at? Someone mentioned fingerprints, and that's a great idea. Medical history of the husband, good. Ballistics, how are you going to do ballistics if you don't have the gun? Psych eval, yep. Blood specialist, nature of the wound. Yeah, these are all really good ideas. Thank you for suggesting the neighbors. One of the things that the police did almost immediately, they did what they call a canvass of the neighborhood, which means they went out and they talked to all of the neighbors and asked all of the questions that you would expect them to ask. You want to know the answer? Nobody heard anything. No one saw anything. It was a big 0. Time of death. Now that's a really interesting idea and a great question. I'll talk to you more about that. Now some of you are starting to talk about more specifics. Check the way the blood was spread. I'm going to come back to that too. Fingerprints on the phone. He was calling from a landline, so a mobile phone wouldn't be something that was available. How close she had been shot is also going to become very interesting in this case. Take his testimony. Whether she was shot somewhere else and brought there. Now I'm doing something to all of you that's very unfair. And let me tell you what I'm doing. I'm only giving you the evidence in little bits. And I'm giving you a little bit of evidence, and then I'm asking you questions, and I'm giving you a little bit more. And some of your questions are going to be answered really soon. I'm sorry for holding back on you. CCTV footage, they checked, there was nothing. All right, let me give you about 1 more minute for your ideas, and then I'll give you some more pictures and see if that changes anything. They were really hopeful in talking to the neighborhood that someone would have seen a strange car or heard the shots to try to confirm the time, and they got absolutely nothing. That turned up to be 0. And that was a feature of this investigation, especially in the first hours, was that they just didn't get a whole lot of information. 0 was kind of the conclusion that everybody got. They checked insurance. Was she going to inherit anything? And the answer was not much. The house didn't have a lot of value. Was it really a gun wound? Yeah, I'm going to show you some pictures here. Let me, I'll stop this discussion for now. Great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing them. And I think that you're on the right track. Let me show you some pictures. And this is the house where it happened. It's a fairly small house by the standards of this neighborhood. It's near to the city, but as you can see, there are trees and it's a fairly large lot. What you can't see is that immediately behind the house, there's a small stream, and Michael's garden is back there. There's a porch on the back. It's a place Michael sat and drank wine in the evenings and smoked. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. I'll tell you now that Ruth wouldn't allow him to drink and smoke in the house, and so he spent a lot of time on that back porch doing those things. I promised you that I would warn you about unpleasant photographs, and I'm going to give you that warning right now. If you don't like looking at blood, you probably should turn away. So I'll give you the count of 5 to do that. 5, 4, 3, 2, okay. Here it comes. There's the bathroom. What do you notice about what you see here? Anything in particular? What's interesting to you about that? Can't see the picture. Okay, it doesn't help much if you can't see the picture. I'm sorry. Fight before. What do you notice about that? Tub full of blood. Yeah. So does the tub full of blood answer the question about where she was shot? Maybe. Struggle marks. Okay, I'm going to show you a closer picture of the blood marks in a minute. She was in the bathtub. Inside and came out. Okay. Something written on the side. Boy, wouldn't that have been great? Anything else about that scene that looks odd to you? This is the part where I'm asking you to read my mind, and that's completely unfair. Let me tell you what I'm thinking of. Look back in the back corner there, and what you can kind of see is that the enamel from the tub is chipped away, and it's like there's a big gash in the tub back there. Okay, what does that suggest, if anything? Let's take another look, and let me show you a close-up of the blood. A number of you mentioned forensic scientist. Yeah, maybe smashed her on the tub. Okay, she was struggling. One of the things that your experts will be able to tell you is how blood was deposited on a particular space. And you splash marks, you can see some of the blood ran, which indicates either that the blood was in liquid form when it was applied or something washed it off, and I think the latter is probably the case here. Sometimes when blood soaks a cloth and the cloth touches something, it will transfer blood to that object, or if there's blood on a body, it will do the same thing. That's a very different kind of blood than the blood that you would expect to see from a gunshot, which is generally called high velocity blood spatter. So this is medium and low velocity blood spatter here, which your expert will be able to tell you quite a lot. She was dumped in the tub filled with water. Okay, good idea. Struggle. There's an attempt to wash the blood stains. He didn't do a very good job, did he? Okay. Let me take a little wider view and show you what the whole bathroom looked like. Okay, does that change your mind about what happened? What can you tell from this photo that you couldn't tell before? She was not shot, okay. Everybody agree with that? Let me show you a close-up picture. Well, what does this picture tell? Do you make anything of the large amount of blood around her head? Okay, there is something about the neck, isn't there? Shot in the bathtub and tried to get out, but she would have fallen face down, okay? Cut marks. Let me tell you what the forensic pathologist determined. Great ideas. You guys are very observant. Blood in the stomach is different. It is, and that's it's very different. Let me tell you what the pathologist said and what we think the investigation revealed. And I'm going to refer to my notes, so I'm not looking directly at you. I'm not trying to be rude, I'm sorry, but I want to make sure that I share all of this with you accurately. Yeah, the blood near the hand always, I never understood what that was about. The doctor said that the bullet entered in the front and passed through and through, without hitting her spinal cord or any bones. The bullet did pass through part of one of her lungs, which may explain some of the blood around her face. The doctor said that the wound was survivable if she got medical assistance immediately. The body shows that the gunshot was at very close range, and what happens is that when a gun is fired, in addition to the bullet coming out of the muzzle, also the products of firing the bullet come out. So you get partially and fully expended gunpowder that come out. And if that's close to a body, it will leave a pattern. Little like pinpricks that are typically red. They call it stippling. And stippling was very observable around her neck. That indicated that the gunshot was at very close range. The medical examiner also said that he viewed that her body was in a defensive position, and he reached the conclusion that she knew that she was going to be shot just before she was shot. He concluded that she was shot, got out of the bathtub, collapsed on the floor, and bled to death in the position that you see her. I don't know about the blood near the hand. Right, when the 911 operator asks if she's alive, he said she's dead. Well, what does that tell you? Is that evidence that's interesting to you in trying to solve this case? Could there have been a delay in calling? Yes, of course. Tremendously significant. All right, let me ask you a couple more questions. So that's basically your physical evidence at this point. Michael was a terrible, terrible suspect because he didn't tell us much of anything. A lot of times he just kind of grumble into his hands and whisper and not say much of anything useful. So let me get you to put on your creative thinking or your critical thinking hats. Think outside the box. And what would you do to try to encourage Michael to provide more information? Would you arrest him at this point? Do you have enough evidence to arrest him? Would you threaten him? Treat him politely? What would be your approach in dealing with this guy who now has become the main suspect? I think you said no to arresting him, okay? Letting him feel he's not suspected, okay? Good technique works really, really well sometimes. And you've seen that on a lot of TV shows, I know, and probably in real life. So you're advocating for a very low-key approach. One thing that they did for him was they bought him food. And that's a pretty common police technique, is to buy people food, because for some reason that helps bond. Tell him he can be a witness. Yeah, that's a difficult thing to do in the United States, because he has an absolute right in the United States not to be a witness. But you might be able to use that. Are we agreed that we don't arrest him? That's one of the things that a couple of the police really wanted to arrest him at this point. And that was my decision as the prosecutor. And I said, no, don't arrest him yet. You don't have enough. and he's of more value out of custody, but follow him and watch him. So we didn't arrest him, but talked to him a lot and very regularly over the course of the next several days. Be polite and make him confess. Okay, how do you, I agree with that approach, but how do you make somebody confess? What do you do? Yeah, okay, could have been a fight between them. Thank you for raising that. Exactly. Could have been a fight. Maybe an accident, okay. Yes, keep him under surveillance, and that's definitely something that we did. And we let him go and bought him a motel room for the night because obviously he wasn't going to be able to go back to the house. Anything else that you do, keep him under surveillance and watch him. Let me ask you a related question, and we're kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to move this a little faster. What do you do next in terms of the investigation? So you've done questioning Michael, sent him to a hotel, leave the door open to ask him more questions. Now what do? You got the house. What do you look for? What's going to be important in solving this case? Yeah, the history about their relationship. Fingerprints on the gun. Okay, but you got to find the gun first, right? Weapons, background check. Okay, all right. We've covered this. I think you gave me many of these. Whether she had any enemies, yeah, and the wealth. Okay, that sets the stage for where we're going next. Let me get to the point in the presentation where I tell you what we found and kind of how it went. And I would encourage you to please continue posing questions. And as I go through this, I'm going to try to keep an eye on the screen here to answer them. And if you have other ideas or think that what I'm saying doesn't make sense, please go ahead and raise that. A reason for motive. And motive, I'm going to speak as a prosecutor. I really want to have a motive because that's the way I argue a case to the jury. Everybody wants to know why. And it really doesn't matter how great your forensic evidence is. If you can't explain why, you've got a big hole in your case. So that's just a great point, and I think a couple of you have made that. Was there a reason for him to kill her? Evidence from the neighborhood. Yeah, great ideas. So one thing that I didn't tell you, and let me go into this now, and this is something that we didn't know right away. This took us a number of days to develop this information. Ruth's family was very cooperative with the police, and that's very frequently that's not the case in criminal investigations. But they thought from the beginning that Michael did it. They were convinced that he was guilty. Whether he had a mistress, okay. You suspect it was really Michael. Yeah, it was really Michael who called 911. We did confirm that. Michael kept saying he didn't know what happened. That was his line. I don't know what happened. And it's very similar to what he told the 911 operator. The family, as I said, they knew in their hearts that Michael did it. And one of them actually said that they had expected this to happen and they weren't surprised. Obviously, they were very sad. This was a terrible event in their lives. But they kept in contact with Michael, and this was a really odd thing about this case, and it's something that for all of the creative thinking that we used, I think we didn't really predict that it would happen until we got to know the family a little bit better, and then we did. Then it became obvious the way this was going to go. The family disliked him intensely, but in spite of that, they invited him to go to dinner, and they invited him over to one of their houses, and they served him dinner. They were very religious, and they had a firm belief that he needed to confess his sins to God in order to be saved, and they encouraged him to do that. And after a long dinner, he did exactly that. And he said, and these were his words, I have taken a beautiful life. He told them it was an accident, that he was trying to make a point with the gun and it accidentally went off. And he gave them sketchy information. He passed that information along to the police, and the police then interviewed him, and he told the police roughly the same thing that he had told the family. Let me share with you just a little bit of information about the nature of their relationship, because this became one of my top priorities in proving my case to the jury. And this comes from lots of discussions with the family and friends, particularly Ruth's sister. She was very close to her sister. And we also found her diary. And she had written many things about her relationship in her diary. And what she said in her diary, among other things, was that they had a number of sexual problems in their relationship, and that Michael was both physically and psychologically abusive to her. He was an alcoholic. His alcohol use was escalating. He drank between 1 and 2 bottles of bad wine every night, continued the verbal abuse. And leading up in the days before the murder, he had increased his drinking. She had arranged for him to go into a treatment program. He wouldn't follow through on it. And one of the things that we noticed when we did the search of the house was that there were empty wine bottles all over the yard and back on the back porch where he went to drink and smoke. So at that point, we had a case, and we were able to rule out a third party. And we were confident that it wasn't suicide. And that was thanks to the relationship with the family, and the fact that the family continued talking with him, and the fact that we left him out of custody long enough for that to happen. Let me tell you a little bit more about the investigation, and then I'll be happy to answer your questions. And keep your questions coming. I'm watching the screen. I showed you a picture of the house before. This is from a little bit different angle. Why was the marble in the tub chipped out? Oh boy, I'm going to tell you that, but you'll have to wait for a few more slides, okay? And he was under the influence of alcohol when he called 911. You can see the yard, and we still didn't have the gun, and we really wanted to have the gun, and we knew that we needed to keep searching. And one of the things that the lead detective noticed, and a couple of you noticed this as well, was that there were pauses in the recording. And he took a stopwatch, and this is critical thinking at its best. He timed the pauses in the stopwatch, and then he went to where the phone was located in the house, and he ran out and to see how far he could get in the amount of time that the pauses represented. And with that, we had a perimeter, and let me kind of show you what that looked like on a map. And we drew a perimeter on the map, and we searched every square meter of that area, including the place where he sat to drink. And we didn't find the gun. And there was a little creek back there, searched in the creek, looked everywhere, no gun. We looked up on the roof of the house, no gun. Looked in the attic of the house, no gun, nothing. And it turned out that the gun was way down the street. And I've put a star at the spot where the gun was eventually found. And this was about a week and a half after the murder occurred that we found the gun. And let me show you a picture of that. So this is kind of looking at that field where the gun was found, and you see the vehicles. That's about the location, although it's actually further away from the house than it looks. It was about a city block, was about the distance, maybe a little bit more than that, between 1 and 2 blocks. So what did that tell us about the timing? Well, that again suggested very strongly that he went and hid the gun before he called 911. And as the prosecutor, that was a great fact to argue to the jury. If he was claiming accident, he took the time to hide the gun rather than call the medics to save his wife. So we got into that field and searched literally every square meter. And there's the gun in a holster. And you can see pretty well hidden in the grass. But interestingly enough, not only did they find the murder weapon, but they found a second gun. He had 2 guns, and he was prohibited from owning any guns because he had a prior felony conviction. He had a felony conviction for criminal mischief, and that made his possession or ownership of any guns illegal. So that starts to get really interesting when you think back to what he said about having a gun to the dispatcher on the phone. There was no silencer. The neighbors just didn't hear the gunshot, and sometimes you hear gunshots, sometimes you don't. We know that from the way that that it goes. But it was interesting that we found 2 guns. I'm going to show you next a picture. This is the murder weapon. It's a .357 revolver. Those of you who know guns know that this is a very powerful, quite heavy gun. The trigger pull, I forget, they measure that in pounds, but it's difficult to pull the trigger accidentally. It takes a lot of strength in your finger to pull the trigger. I don't know the source of the gun. He may have gotten it from a friend. He may have owned it before he was convicted of the crime. Unknown. There are a lot of guns in the United States, and we never did find out where he got the gun. But now let me circle back to the question that one of you asked about the bathtub. And I'll show you a picture of the slug. This was recovered. Any guesses where we found this? This is the bullet that killed Ruth. Where do you think we found that bullet? Yep, you're right. Bonus points to you. Couldn't see it when they first went to the scene because, if you'll remember right, the bathtub was full of blood. When they drained the blood out, guess what they found in the bottom of the bathtub? And the ballistics, of course, showed that was the bullet. And with that big piece of damage on the back end of the bathtub, it was very easy to determine exactly where Michael had been standing, because we knew the path that the bullet took through Ruth's body, and we knew where it ended up because it took all of the enamel off of the bathtub. And all you had to do, and what we did actually was we got a police detective who was about the same size as Ruth, and she sat in the bathtub. And we used a long rod, and we literally diagrammed where that bullet would have been. And from the stippling, which is the pattern from the gunpowder from the gun, we knew how far away he was when he fired. We were able to describe for the jury exactly where he was standing when he fired the gun. So that's basically the case. Let me tell you what happened at trial. We went to trial in this case, jury trial, 12 people on the jury. Michael testified, and he claimed that he was trying to make a point to Ruth, but the gun accidentally went off. And he freaked out and went to hide the gun because he knew he wasn't supposed to have the gun. And Ruth was dead by the time he called 911. And he was really sorry, and he cried, but it was an accident, and please don't convict him because it wasn't an intentional act. And that's one of the statutory requirements in this particular case, was that he intentionally caused Ruth's death. The family testified at length about the history of marital problems. I was able to read to the jury from Ruth's diary, which described all sorts of things that you can imagine, but I haven't had a chance to go into it. Ruth's sister was a missionary in Cambodia at the time this happened, and it turned out that they were very close, and she had confided in her sister a lot of things, and she was a very unhappy person. As I mentioned before, we had expert testimony about ballistics and the fact that this is not a gun that goes off without a very strong pull on the trigger. And as I also mentioned to you before, the doctor testified that if the ambulance had been called immediately, that Ruth probably would have lived. He was standing right next to the bathtub, and the gun was probably at about the level of Ruth's eyes, or maybe a little bit higher than that. And it passed down. I wish I had a diagram. I'm so sorry, and I don't know how to do this effectively with the technology that we have, so you'll just have to imagine that it was a downward angle, the shot was, and it passed through her neck and out her shoulder in the back, right where that shoulder would have been up against the bathtub. And that's undoubtedly where she was sitting. And so what we did was we took a long pole and we ran it where it would have been, and did the measurements, and put him probably about in line with the edge of the tub at a level probably about this far above where Ruth was. And he admitted when he testified, yeah, that was about right. The body ended up outside of the tub because he went to hide the gun, and she, for whatever reason, got out of the tub and collapsed from lack of blood flow, blood loss. Was this due to consumption of alcohol? In this jurisdiction, voluntary intoxication is a very, very high standard, very difficult to meet, and he didn't claim that. We all conceded that he had probably been drinking, but the argument that I made to the jury was that he had all of his faculties about him, because he knew he was in trouble because he'd killed his wife and because he wasn't supposed to have a gun. And so his mind was working well enough and clearly enough to go hide not only the gun that he used to commit the murder, but also the other gun that he knew the police would find. I don't think she was standing on the tub, and the blood evidence indicated that she got out of the tub. She had to step out because it was the usual sized bathtub. She was shot in her front, in the neck, and the blood probably came out of her mouth because the bullet punctured her lung, which would have caused bleeding from the mouth. Remember, she probably lived for about 10 minutes, so she was breathing and aspirating blood at the time that she was getting out. There was that clear stripe across her mouth, and we believe that there was probably water or something that washed across there. That was the conclusion. A lot of this we don't know with 100% certainty, but the evidence when you take it together is pretty conclusive that she's shot in the bathtub, and I'm 100% certain of that. That she got out of the bathtub on her own, 100% certain of that. And how each of the pieces of blood, drops of blood got there, little harder to know. She definitely knew she had been shot, and obviously she collapsed almost immediately. She was bleeding profusely. So she knew that she was going to be shot, according to the medical examiner. Struggled to get out of the bathtub. What was she thinking? Go get help, probably, if she was thinking that clearly, and she didn't make it very far. And during this time, Michael was out hiding the gun. We had a couple of things that happened during that time period that I didn't tell you about because they didn't turn out to be relevant. He ordered pizza, and he probably did that after he shot her. And we talked to the pizza delivery guy, who didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't allowed in the house, but we did things like that. We also did something that was really, really nasty, and I will share that with you now. It didn't turn out to work, but we left the bloody mess in the bathroom for him to clean up, and we were hoping that would provoke a reaction in him, an emotional reaction that would cause him to talk. And maybe it did work, I don't know, but it was usually in these crime scenes, we would clean them up, but we intentionally did not do that, hoping to encourage him to share what had happened. And that was another, that was not my idea, but one of the detectives came up with that, and that was another piece of critical thinking that I don't know where he got that idea, but it was an interesting idea. So I I'm essentially done with my presentation. Let me tell you how all of this ends before you wonder. Michael was convicted of intentional murder, and he's serving a life sentence in prison. And I will answer your questions now before I wrap up. Oh, thank you. You're too kind. I don't know that it's as good as Bones, but I really prefer sharing actual stories to illustrate points rather than doing a lecture. And someone has to see him running down the yard. You know, it was dark and nobody saw him. You would think somebody would have seen him or heard the gunshot. They didn't. Let me get back to what I was saying, and then I'll circle back to your questions because they're great ones. You all helped make this, if this presentation was interesting, it was because of your participation. And I'm really encouraged that we can use this platform to have you participate and not just sit back and listen to lectures, which are good, but this is helpful too. Psychological analysis, yeah, we did a psychological analysis on him. It concluded that he was an alcoholic and pretty much nothing else. Obviously, there's something wrong with him, but it didn't rise to the level of a mental disease or defect, at least at legal, to a legal level. The way that we found the gun, dogs work well if they have a scent to follow, and that wasn't the case. So what we typically do in the U.S. is we use deputies or sometimes even explorer scouts, and they do what they call is a grid search. And they literally will go at arm's length to each other and comb through every square inch of the area that they're looking at. And that's what we did in order to find the guns, was we did one of those grid searches. And we had a bunch of people out there looking. And it was a difficult search. You saw the way that that yard, the area looked with that thick grass, and the gun had creeped down and was very nicely hidden. They were really pleased when they found the gun. Thanks for your kind thoughts. We've turned on the microphones. If anyone wants to say anything or ask your questions with your microphones, you're welcome to do that. You're welcome to ask written questions as well, or share any other thoughts that you may have about this case. I'm going to save about 3 minutes at the very end to just do a really brief summary, but we've got a couple more minutes before we get to that. So thank you so much. Your comments are very encouraging. This is fun. We all like doing this. How do you keep track of person? Okay, constant violations of rights. Two separate questions and great questions. We followed him 24 hours a day. We had police on him, watching him from a distance, and surveilled him. Violations of his rights is a broad topic, and obviously that was a tremendous concern. At one point, he invoked his right to remain silent. Under the U.S. case of Miranda, that meant we had to quit talking to him. He reinitiated the conversation, and it's fairly complicated legally, and it's a procedure that's limited to the United States. But in short, once someone invokes their rights under Miranda not to talk, all questioning has to cease. And we honored that. But he reinitiated conversation with the officer. And under the cases in the U.S., if the suspect reinitiates and waives his right to remain silent and to subject himself to questioning, then it's okay. And that's what happened in this case. Yeah, if not for the family intervention, I don't know. I think it would have been a tough case to make without the family involvement. I think we could have done it because Ruth's diary was very powerful. But the family testimony really was important. And I can also say and this is going to make it sound like I'm a great trial lawyer, and that's not my intent in saying this at all. He did a very, very poor job on cross-examination. There were a lot of inconsistencies in his story, a lot of things that just the accident claim just didn't make sense. And I think that he was his own worst witness. I think it might have been a strategically poor decision for him to testify, but you never know. And I think that he probably had to testify in order to claim that it was an accident. So I don't know, that's, you know, as a lawyer, especially if you're a defense lawyer, that's an interesting strategic question. Do you, and in the US, you don't have to testify. And so do you let your client testify, and how do you prepare them? Was it impulsive or pre-planned? Probably depends on your definition. So what I mean by that, the family thought this was going to happen. So they obviously had some feelings or evidence or information that all was not right. My own belief was that he didn't take that gun into the bathroom intending to kill her, but at some point he did intend to kill her because he pulled the trigger, and pulling the trigger was a very, very intentional act. I think there's no doubt they were arguing. I think that she, whatever was doing, was not giving him the answers or the response that he wanted. I'm sure the alcohol played a part in that, and he decided whether it was over a minute or a half a minute or a half a second, I don't know. But it was still an intentional act to pull the trigger. And that met the threshold of the murder statute under which he was tried. If at the time he killed her, it was intentional, that means that he was guilty of intentional murder. And 12 people on the jury decided that that was the case. Yeah, you raise an interesting question about the difference, and there's a very, very strong difference in the law related to admissions and confessions as between the United States and Sri Lanka. Confessions in the United States are absolutely admissible if they are not coerced, they are voluntary, and they are given pursuant to a waiver of the suspect's Miranda rights. So what happens is that in order for me as the prosecutor to have the judge rule the confession admissible, I've got to prove that the Miranda rights were given. And yeah, you've all watched enough TV shows. You know that in the US you have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I'm doing this by memory, and my guess is that probably at least half of you can probably do it by memory too. Anyway, what we do is have a hearing to determine, one, whether those rights were given, two, whether there was a knowing and intelligent waiver of those rights by the suspect, and three, whether the confession was voluntary and not the product of coercion. So typically I would ask the police, did you promise him anything or threaten him if he didn't talk to you? No. And did he know that he could leave at any time? Well, no, he was under arrest, but he didn't have to talk to you, right? No, he didn't have to. And did you read his Miranda rights? Yes. What exactly did you tell him were his Miranda rights? And the officer will read them. Did he waive those rights? Yes. What did he do? He signed the card. And that's generally the way that would go, although there would be quite a lot more talk about the circumstances to show the judge that it was not coerced. So that's a tremendous difference and plays into the strategy, obviously, because there's a difference in the law. And so I hope that that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but it's, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting area, and you hear a lot about Miranda. I'm going to give you about 2 more minutes and then I'm going to wrap up. And if you don't want to take 2 minutes, I'll let you go to dinner early. His defense was that it was an accident, not an intentional act. Thanks. I'm gonna wrap up now, I think. And I think Lakmali, maybe you took my control away. There's one more slide that I'd like to do. let me just go ahead and summarize, and I think I've tried to point this out as we went along. I like sharing this case because I think it's such great examples of critical thinking. And what we did, some of the things that I've listed here, and I'm not going to read them because we've already talked about them already. But you can see how what we tried to do was encourage brainstorming, thinking outside of the box, being creative, being analytical, looking at all of the aspects of this investigation to get enough evidence to prove who did what and to be able to take the case to trial. And it was through the work of very, very capable investigators that this worked out. And Michael Taylor is someone who richly and profoundly deserves to be in prison. And I'm very happy at 6:52 on this evening in Sri Lanka to tell you that he is right now, as the sun is coming up in Oregon, sitting in prison, and I expect he will die there. So with that, I will conclude the presentation, and just my final thanks to all of you for being so great in participating. We thank you very much. Thank you, CLS, and hope to see you all again, maybe in person. Thank you.